Good evening, and good morning. We're worldwide. A worldwide podcast, YouTube channel, blah, blah, blah. We're everywhere. 177 strong. And we're still worldwide. How about that? Thank you, DARPA. Thank you, DARPA, for the internet. Did I say that out loud? I'm sorry. Thank you, Al Gore, for the internet. I forgot that Al Gore created the internet. DARPA. What does DARPA do? What does DARPA do? It sounds like something that Mr. Rogers would say to one of his little furry friends. What does DARPA do? Anyway, whatever. Stream number 2 for the day. Welcome to Armor of Truth Radio or podcast or whatever it is. It's just a show, a stream where I share with you things like this. For example, this website here called armoroftruth.net, where you can go and read articles. You can check out the videos here. They're playlisted for you to find Bible studies, Book of Daniel, Book of Revelation. Check it out. All of these Armor of Truth radio shows are there, playlisted for you as well. I know everyone uses YouTube, but in the event YouTube is no longer an option, we have a website. Okay, so let's get down to business. Right here on this Armor of Truth website, if you go there, it's armoroftruth.net. Trying to create a community there. Come join the forums. You can join the forums with your social media account. Let's see here. We have some topics up there right now. Creation versus evolution. General discussion. You want to bring something up? Try it out right there. Agenda 21, Sustainable Development. There's a forum. Tell us what you're seeing in your hometown. Are you finding out anything? Are you seeing some weird things going on in your town? Some strange land acquisitions or strange non-governmental organizations at work in your town? Tell us about it there in the forum. Also very important, the most important forums that we have right now, and we'll expand these forums out as needed. We have a forum for prayer requests. And also, if you want to ask some Bible questions, you have anything you want to ask or share, whatever, right there. Ask your Bible questions right there. And also at armoroftruth.net, you can click the donate tab, and that is where, for right now, we have one option to donate with PayPal. It is possible to use your debit card or whatever that you want to just click on that. Click on that link and you'll see it. You have options there. And pretty soon I will have a P.O. box listed here under the donate tab for donations and also for those who might want to send books over, for research or whatever. Use it for whatever. Just don't send anthrax or bombs. I appreciate it. Poison gummy bears. We don't want that. All right. National Public Radio has exposed MK Ultra. So, good job. Congratulations to Terry Gross. She's been red-pilled, and she has red-pilled the world, the mainstream. Is that right? Is that really what happened? We're going to find out. We're going to talk about it. There is a new article out right here The CIA's secret quest for mind control, torture, LSD, and a poisoner in chief. From September 9th, 2019, heard on Terry Gross's NPR show called Fresh Air. Hey, they have a donate tab too. Imagine that. And they're funded by the government. Now, who needs to donate to that? I mean, honestly, I'm not trying to, come on. Let's talk about NPR. Who funds NPR? Let's see. First of all, National Public Radio is an American privately and publicly funded nonprofit membership media organization based in Washington, D.C. NPR differs from other nonprofit membership media organizations such as AP in that it was established by an act of Congress. This radio station was established by an act of Congress. In other words, it belongs to the Congress. And most of its member stations are owned by government entities, often public universities. It serves as a national syndicator to a network of over 1,000 public radio stations in the United States. And as you move around in the United States, especially in the South or on the East Coast, from the East Coast to the Mississippi, whatever city you're in, you can find probably about 3 different public radio stations that broadcast NPR content. It's ubiquitous. I mean, you can find it everywhere. NPR produces and distributes news and cultural programming. Individual public radio stations are not required to broadcast all NPR programs. Most broadcast a mix. Okay, that's it. Content from American public media. Okay, blah, blah, blah. Well, here's what we want to know. What's the funding? Where do they get their funding? First of all, the governance. NPR is a membership organization. No, that's not what we want. We want to talk about their funding. How do they get who pays the bills? Who keeps the lights on? In other words, who controls the message that comes out of NPR? In 2010, NPR revenues totaled $180 million. Yet they have a donate tab. Isn't that sweet? With the bulk of revenues coming from programming fees, grants from foundations or business entities, contributions, and sponsorships. They get money from everywhere, and they're government subsidized. They're not poor. They're not hurting over there. According to the 2009 financial statement, about 50% of NPR revenues come from the fees it charges member stations for programming and distribution charges. Typically, NPR member stations receive funds through on-air pledge drives. But no, let's back up. $180 million. Understand that NPR is just one station. It syndicates its material out to all of these other stations, which are funded on their own. So I could do a lot with $180 million. I'm not saying I need $180 million. I think probably do pretty well. Could probably do fairly well with 1/10 of that and put out a reasonably good production, I would think. So anyway, we've got some decent salaries over there at NPR. And from pledge drives, corporate underwriting, also funded by corporations, state and local governments, educational institutions, and the federally funded Corporation for Public Broadcasting. In 2009, member stations derived 6% of their revenue from federal, state, and local government funding, 10% of their revenue from CBP grants, and blah, blah, blah. The idea is here. It says here, during the 70s and 80s, the majority of NPR funding came from the federal government. Steps were taken in the 1980s to completely wean NPR from government support. But the 1983 funding crisis forced the network to make immediate changes. According to CBP in 2009, 11.3% of the aggregate revenues of all public radio broadcasting stations were funded from federal sources. That's 2009. And it says 11.3 of their revenues come from federal sources. And we just found out right up here the rest of that money comes from grants, from foundations. What is foundation? It's a category of a nonprofit organization or charitable trust that will typically provide funding and support for other charitable organizations. In other words, you scratch my back and I'll scratch yours. You make sure that you keep your narrative right here and where I want it, and I will give you $10 million every year. So don't fall for the hype that NPR is the last bastion of free media, because of that. That's just a lie. That's just not true. Business entities, contributions and sponsorships. The only way that you can have a truly independent media outlet is for it to be funded by the people who watch it or listen to it. For instance, Armor of Truth Ministry would be a completely independent media source, funded completely and only by those who consume the content. You see, if you have any large groups come in and donate large amounts of money to a media outlet, they take control of the narrative. Because that media outlet becomes beholden, they become used to having $180 million on hand. Therefore, if one of those sponsors or corporate sponsors wants to bow out because maybe NPR's not staying in the lane they would hope, well, that would really hurt business over there, because they're a nonprofit. That means that all the money that comes in goes to paying the employees and putting on the show. So anyway, we get the idea here. NPR has an agenda. There is an agenda at NPR. That's just how that animal works. So they have an article titled "The CIA's Secret Quest for Mind Control." All right, about torture, LSD, and a poisoner in chief. And this article comes from an interview that Terry Gross did with a man named Stephen Kinzer. Yes, journalist Stephen Kinzer, who has, well, let's just read it. During the early period of the Cold War, the CIA became convinced that communists had discovered a drug or technique that would allow them to control human minds. In response, the CIA began its own secret program called MK Ultra. They didn't start it as MK Ultra. Now it had some names before that. Is that maybe Artichoke and Naomi? Either way, that's close enough for what we're going to be talking about here. Anyway, to search for a mind control drug that could be weaponized against enemies. Well, that's the official story. Weaponized against enemies, but the story goes deeper. MK Ultra, which operated from the 1950s until the early 60s. Yeah, that's also not true, but let's keep going. Was created and run by a chemist named Sidney Gottlieb. Journalist Stephen Kinzer, who spent several years investigating the program, calls the operation the, quote, most sustained search in history for techniques of mind control. That you can't argue with. That's a true statement. Now, the reason I've pulled this article and decided to present it here tonight is because we're going to look at this article and we're going to talk about how you read a mainstream article and filter it out with critical thinking, with the understanding that you're not going to get the whole truth. You're going to get facts, the 80-20 rule, 80%, 20%. You might get 80% good facts. And then 20% of either misinformation or 20% of the information is just left out and not talked about. And that's what I think we have here with this particular offering from government and corporate funded NPR. Now, I also have for you I have queued up a documentary called Mission Mind Control, an ABC documentary from 1979. Now, the reason I have that prepared is because we're going to show from that documentary from 1979 all the points that were left out of this 2019 article. "30 years ago, a mainstream network did a documentary on MK Ultra, and it was far more in depth and detailed than what we've got here from NPR, who, if you look on the internet, if you just do a Google search, and you'll see how people are talking about this. They're talking about how NPR has red-pilled the country about MK Ultra, and how NPR has exposed MK Ultra. Well, they've really done no such thing. They have done not even a good job. They have done some sort of job at introducing it to the public. So let's get into the article, and then I'll pull up I'll show you the video, elements from the video as needed. Some of Gottlieb's experiments were covertly funded at universities and research centers. Now, remember, who is it that funds NPR? Oh, that was government entities and universities. Okay. The point I'm trying to make is the very same funding structure that funded and funds still today this operation and ones like it, ones that sub-projects that come after it that still exist today, they're both funded by the same people. It's not likely you're going to get the whole truth from basically the same entity. All right. Kinzer says, while others were conducted in American prisons and in detention centers in Japan, Germany, and the Philippines, many of his unwitting subjects, Sidney Gottlieb's unwitting subjects, endured psychological torture ranging from electroshock to high doses of LSD, according to Kinzer's research. Gottlieb wanted to create a way to seize control of people's minds, and he realized it was a two-part process. Now, first of all, we're getting the idea that this is Sidney Gottlieb's baby, that this is his idea, right? Gottlieb wanted to create a way to seize control of people's minds. No. The CIA, those who fund the CIA. Now, that's another podcast altogether. That money comes from above and beyond the government. That comes from the bloodlines. We'll get to that. That's something that we will talk about here. But for now, let's stick with what we have. So it's not just Sidney Gottlieb's baby. This is a project, a mass experimentation funded by and appropriated by elements of the intelligence agency. You'll see it's not just the CIA. We'll get to that. But this article would have you believe it's just a CIA thing and they unwittingly, they were bumbling around. They're going to lead you down the wrong path. Gottlieb wanted to create a way to seize control of people's minds, and he realized it was a two-part process. Kinzer says, quote, first you had to blast away the existing mind. Second, you had to find a way to insert a new mind into that resulting void. We didn't get too far on number 2, but we did a lot of work on number 1. Well, we'll take the word for it right there. We're going to see in a moment that that's not the whole truth. Now, what we have to ask is, who is Stephen Kinzer? We need to find out more about him because, we realize that gatekeepers exist in our society today. They must exist. If you remember, just a little while ago on the stream, I was saying that objective truth is the enemy of empire. You can't have an intelligence agency and promote objective truth. There has to be quite a lot of deception in order to keep an empire propped up. Kinzer notes, that's what I'm asking, who is the author of this book? Because it seems like he's leaving quite a lot out of the story. You can check Jan Irvin's offerings on MKUltra and the CIA. I would say stick to that material if you go to that resource. Just stick, because that research is really good. And Clint Richardson on his website, realityblogger.com, is also has excellent work on this topic. Kinzer notes that the top secret nature of Gottlieb's work makes it impossible to measure the human cost of his experiments. Quote, "We don't know how many people died, but a number did, and many lives were permanently destroyed," unquote. Ultimately, Gottlieb concluded that mind control was not possible. Really? After MKUltra shut down, that's another probably deception. There's no indication that this thing was shut down. The documents were shredded, were burned. Just a handful of documents made it out. That's what I'm saying. Jan Irvin did it at his, Gnostic Media? I don't know, at Logos Media, I think it's called now. He has a lot of research there. I think he was actually able to get a hold of some of these primary source documents. In other words, this has been reported on. This is old news. NPR is trying to offer up as something new, and this person's book that he's written seems to have a lot of holes in it, as far as what we see, at least here in this article, that explains what's in the book. So this seems to be maybe where you see, let's say the cat might be out of the bag. So in order to do damage control, we have to come back and start producing some books and some papers where we can kind of control the narrative back to something that seems less diabolical. Ultimately, Sidney Gottlieb concluded that mind control was not possible. So after MKUltra shut down, he went on to lead a CIA program that created poisons and high-tech gadgets for spies to use. Now, one of the main questions about Project MKUltra and all the sub-projects is, what was it really trying to accomplish? We hear that it's about mind control, and that they maybe wanted to create the perfect spy or the perfect assassin who could be sent out into the field, could be programmed, sent out into the field to do a task, to assassinate someone or retrieve some information, and come back and have no memory of doing the thing. That way they could never be, cross-examined at any point. They would have no memory of what they did. Now, the truth about this operation is that it went far, far beyond just that and got deeper into maybe how do you control large groups of people. We'll see that when we look at the documentary in just a bit. A case can be made that what was learned from the MKUltra projects was put to use to create an entire counterculture on purpose. You will hear from this article that it was a side effect. But let's keep reading. Kinzer writes about Gottlieb and MK Ultra in his new book called Poisoner in Chief. And this picture, this is Sidney Gottlieb here on your screen now. Dr. Sidney Gottlieb. Here are some of the interview highlights. Here is where I have lots of highlights. There's a lot of highlighter on these in this article that I'll be pulling ideas out. Okay. On how the CIA brought LSD to America. As part of the search for drugs that would allow people to control the human mind, CIA scientists became aware of the existence of LSD. And this became an obsession for the early directors of MK Ultra. Actually, the MK Ultra director, Sidney Gottlieb, can now be seen as the man who brought LSD to America. He was the unwitting godfather of the entire LSD counterculture. I would challenge the term unwitting. But okay, we'll grant him that. He didn't know what he couldn't foresee what was going to happen. But all right, he's just one man. In the early 1950s, he arranged for the CIA to pay $240,000 to buy the world's entire supply of LSD. He brought this to the United States, and he began spreading it around to hospitals, clinics, prisons, and other institutions, asking them through bogus foundations to carry out research projects and find out what LSD was, how people reacted to it, and how it might be able to be used as a tool for mind control. Now, there's where we get into the first bit of information that doesn't quite match up with what we already knew. In the early 1950s, he arranged for the CIA to pay $250,000 to buy the world's entire supply of LSD. Okay, so let me just pull that piece up for you now from the documentary from 1979. I got to find it in my notes. Let's try it right here. 23:43.
The CIA was not the only government agency interested in the possibilities LSD and other drugs presented for mind control. The Army Chemical Corps first started working with the CIA and then branched off on its own. It too tested drugs on unwitting victims, and a death would result. The case of this man, Harold Blower, a tennis pro, seen here with his daughter Elizabeth, is well known. In 1953, Blower was a private patient at the New York State Psychiatric Institute. He was given 5 injections of a mescaline derivative that was being tested secretly for the Army Chemical Corps. With the 5th injection, Harold Blower died. As with the Olson case, at 22 years...
Okay, we're gonna skip ahead because we're trying to follow along with this article. Now, that story about that man is sad. That's bad. You can watch this video on YouTube for yourself. It's just called Mission Mind Control. It's easy to find. Now, let's listen to about the 5,000 declassified Army documents.
It's unbelievable.
A suit filed by Elizabeth Barrett against the Army Chemical Corps is now pending in federal court. Other Army experiments continued on mental patients around the country. Work done at the Tulane Medical Center in New Orleans involved several drugs, hallucinogenics, and electrodes implanted in the brain. The chief researcher was...
It's right here. I had the wrong section.
George White.
Now let's listen right here where we talk about the discovery of LSD. What I've just read here, I played the wrong clip, but what we just heard here was, in the early 1950s, Gottlieb arranged arranged for the CIA to pay $250,000 to buy the world's entire supply of LSD. And then he brought this supply to the United States. Now, let's hear this report.
With the Truth Drug Committee here at St. Elizabeth's Hospital in the nation's capital. They experimented with mescaline, scopolamine, and marijuana on unwitting victims. The committee soon learned there was no easy panacea, no truth drug at this stage. But White and later colleagues would not stop trying. The goal remained the same. As this 1952 CIA memo says, the aim is controlling an individual to the point where he will do our bidding against his will, and even against such fundamental laws of nature as self-preservation. But it was a discovery here in Basel, Switzerland.
Here we go.
At Sandoz Laboratories by Dr. Albert Hoffman.
Albert Hoffman in Basel, Switzerland. This is where we're going to find out where the LSD actually came from, and was it actually $240,000 worth of it? Listen closely.
It led the intelligence agencies of America to believe that they had found the panacea. The discovery was lysergic acid diethylamide, LSD. The film that you see is considered by many experts to be the closest illustration of the effects of a hallucinogenic.
It was one of the first times that anybody had run into a powerful drug that was different than anything else that they knew anything about.
John Gittinger, recently retired chief psychologist for the CIA. This is the first time Gittinger has been interviewed publicly.
Okay, that was 1979, so I don't know. Since then, other things have happened. But remember, chief psychologist on staff for the CIA. This man has a security clearance. In other words, there are things that he can't say. That makes him not so good of a witness. He has, in other words, he has an incentive to leave things out or to deceive.
We could disable a whole city by putting a very small amount on a water supply. After all of these years of us, those of us who are involved in looking for this secret drug, this was the only thing that began to look for the first time like it might be something like that.
The CIA's interest in LSD was intense. The worry was that the Russians would get hold of it. Were the Soviets into LSD?
It's always about the Russians, right? Everything is about the Russians. The Russians have been the United States' best friend for so long because they're such a good boogeyman. They're always there waiting to play their role.
I'm going to have to say I'm sure they were, but if you ask me to prove it, I've never seen any direct proof of it.
But it was.
Now, they were worried about, in the article here, it explains that they were worried very much about the Russians had LSD or had mind control chemicals, but what this man just told us was that he saw no evidence of that. Again, he was on staff. He has security clearance. It's difficult to know. Take what he says with a grain of salt. But the important part of this clip is coming up.
At one point, intelligence information received from Switzerland said that Sandoz Laboratories was about to put 100 million doses of LSD on the open market.
Okay, the report was they were going to put 100 million doses onto the market. That is where the $240,000 would have come into play. But now listen closely. Now, remember what we were just told here is that in the early 50s, Gottlieb arranged for the CIA to pay $250,000 for the world's supply of LSD. Now we've learned it came from Basel. Now listen to this.
And it caused enough concern within the agency that the United States was prepared to buy the entire supply. However, a slight mistake had been made.
Uh-oh.
The mistake is made public for the first time.
I just found out on a new CIA document that there were no such large quantities of LSD on the market.
John Marks has filed numerous Freedom of Information suits against the CIA and has unearthed much new material. He is the author of The Search for the Manchurian Candidate, a history of intelligence agency work with mind control. He is a consultant for this report.
What happened is that there was a military attaché in Switzerland, an American officer, who got milligrams and kilograms mixed up.
Uh-oh.
In other words, he made a mistake of thinking 1/1000th of a gram was the same as 1,000 grams, which is a mistake of 1,000,000 times. So when the CIA got the intelligence that there were 100 million doses on the market, in fact, there were 100 doses.
Okay, so effectively what we've just learned here is that in the 1950s, according to the article from NPR and this Mr. Kinzer's book, in the early 50s, Gottlieb arranged to pay for the CIA to pay $250,000 to buy the world's entire supply of LSD, which was 100 doses. Not 100,000, not 100 million, but 100 doses. So, at least this, I'm not, who's right or who's wrong. I'm not interested. I'm just showing you, here's the contradiction. This is what we're doing is we're going through the article critically, trying to figure out what can we take as being plausible and what's not plausible. So this report that he actually arranged it, now maybe they did, maybe they paid $250,000 for 100 doses of 100 hits of acid. I don't know. What I'm pointing out to you is the contradictions are a many.
The man who would oversee the CIA's research into drugs and most of the agency's behavior programs is this man, Dr. Sidney Gottlieb, a chemist. Dr. Gottlieb declined ABC News' request for an interview.
Okay, so there we're introduced in the documentary to Sidney Gottlieb. Now let's continue with the article. Now, the people who volunteered for these experiments and began taking LSD in many cases found it very pleasurable. According to the article anyway, they found it very pleasurable. Now, I'm not going to say that that's not true. Maybe some did. I'm sure some did. They told their friends about it. Who were those people? Well, number one, for example, Ken Kesey, the author of One Who Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, got his LSD in an experiment sponsored by the CIA by MK Ultra by Sidney Gottlieb. So did Robert Hunter, the lyricist for the Grateful Dead, which went on to become a great purveyor of LSD culture. Allen Ginsberg, the poet who preached the value of the great personal adventure of using LSD, got his first LSD from Sidney Gottlieb. Although, of course, he never knew that name, is what the article says. Now, what's more likely is that Ken Kesey, author of One Who Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, Robert Hunter, lyricist for the Grateful Dead, who was placed right in a good position to influence lots of young people, Allen Ginsberg, a poet who's in a position to influence lots of young people. What's more likely is that all of these folks were recruited for that purpose. Now, whether or not they knew Gottlieb, that's not important. The article, the book, the way the article describes the book is that these men really weren't aware of what they were getting into or what they were doing. Paints them as useful idiots. I don't buy that. Let's go on. Let's move on to the next piece. So the CIA brought LSD to America unwittingly. Now, they just told us up here earlier that in the 1950s, Gottlieb had arranged to buy the world's supply of LSD on the behalf of the CIA. Two paragraphs down, it says, so the CIA brought LSD to America unwittingly. That's a contradiction. How could you say that in your article? Continuing, now this is where it gets interesting. This is where we see the New Age start to appear and promotion of mysticism. Listen up. And actually, it is a tremendous irony that the drug that the CIA hoped would be its key to controlling humanity actually wound up fueling a generational rebellion that was dedicated to destroying everything that the CIA held dear and defended. Do you believe that? Do you believe that the CIA just was so incompetent that they just accidentally caused a cultural revolution? Not a good one. Remember what that cultural revolution was. It was mysticism. It was the idea that you find God by going inside your own mind, and LSD is a way to facilitate that process. Now, if we take what we've learned from studying communitarian agenda, the Agenda 21, the idea has been around for a long time that we need to call people into communities to make them easier to manage. So this so-called generational rebellion from the 1960s, this cultural revolution, was really just another way to degrade society. In other words, if you're going to put a whole new world order in place, what is the first thing you have to do? You have to destroy the old one. You have to tear down all the traditions that were there before. We really see that hardcore today. But in the 60s, at the time that this was all going on, you could see it hardcore right there too, in that moment, where the idea was to tear down all the traditions. Not all at one time. You're not going to tear them all down at once. In the 60s, the focus was on, the young folks, the teenagers and the 20-somethings. Let's have them reject tradition and start clamoring for a new way, a new age. And then at points throughout the years after, different segments of society are, quote unquote, attacked. Okay, so now, is it true that the CIA unwittingly did all this? Let's see what Mr. Timothy Leary has to say about that. There you go. Did the CIA unwittingly cause this cultural revolution, this rebellion? Did they shoot themselves in the foot?
About this so-called mind-blowing drug, and suddenly there was the counterculture of the 60s.
I give the CIA a total credit for sponsoring and initiating the entire consciousness movement, counterculture events of the 1960s.
Dr. Timothy Leary, the 1960s Johnny Appleseed of LSD.
The CIA funded and supported and encouraged hundreds of young psychiatrists to experiment with this drug.
So, does it sound to me like you could make a great case for that claim that the CIA unwittingly caused this revolution or this degradation of society, to put it like that, on how MKUltra experimented on prisoners, including crime boss Whitey Bulger. Whitey Bulger was one of the prisoners who volunteered for what he was told was an experiment aimed at finding a cure for schizophrenia. As part of this experiment, he was given LSD every day for more than a year. He later realized that this had nothing to do with schizophrenia, and he was a guinea pig in a government experiment aimed at seeing what people's long-term reactions to LSD was. Okay, that's testing on someone who was a prisoner, yes, but is that ethical? Essentially, the question was, could we make a person lose his mind by feeding him LSD every day over such a long period? Bulger wrote afterward about his experiences, which he described as quite horrific. He said he thought he was going insane. Now, a few paragraphs back up, it says, now the people who volunteered for these experiments began taking LSD. In many cases, they found it very pleasurable. Now, this was the Ken Keseys, Robert Hunters, Allen Ginsbergs. Bulger wrote, I was in prison for committing a crime, but they committed a greater crime on me. And towards the end of his life, Bulger came to realize the truth of what had happened to him. And he actually told his friends that he was going to find that doctor in Atlanta who was the head of that experiment program in the penitentiary and go kill him. Okay, now on the CIA hiring Nazi doctors and Japanese torturers to learn methods. The CIA mind control project, MKUltra, was essentially a continuation of work that began in Japanese and Nazi concentration camps. Not only was it roughly based on those experiments, but the CIA actually hired the vivisectionists and the torturers who had worked in Japan and in Nazi concentration camps to come and explain what they had found out so that we could build on their research. I know you know what the word torturers means, but how about vivisectionists? That's cutting bodies in half, cutting people up. That's vivisection. So we thought it would be a good idea to bring those guys over and see what we could learn from them about how to get control of someone's mind. Let me remind you that tax dollars are what funded this. Are we going to believe that this doesn't happen today? Are we going to be that naive? For example, Nazi doctors had conducted extensive experiments with mescaline at the Dachau concentration camp, and the CIA was very interested in figuring out whether mescaline could be the key to mind control. That was one of their big avenues of investigation. So they hired the Nazi doctors who had been involved in that project to advise them. Another thing the Nazis provided was information about poison gases like sarin, which is still being used. Nazi doctors came to America, to Fort Detrick, Maryland, which was the center of this project, to lecture to CIA officers to tell them how long it took for people to die from sarin. Fort Detrick, Maryland is very important because if you remember the anthrax scare right after 9/11, when the news and the propaganda told everyone that it was terrorists from some faraway land who had infiltrated our sovereignty and safety and was sending deadly pathogens to people in the mail. No, what actually was learned was that all of those, that strain of anthrax came directly from Fort Detrick, Maryland. That's not a conspiracy theory. That's just an available fact now. Fort Detrick, Maryland is a very important place for many events like this. Okay, so on the more extreme experiments Gottlieb conducted overseas, Gottlieb and the CIA established secret detention centers throughout Europe and East Asia, particularly in Japan, Germany, and the Philippines, which were largely under American control in the period of the early 1950s, and therefore Gottlieb didn't have to worry about any legal entanglements in these places. CIA officers in Europe and Asia were capturing enemy agents and others who they felt might be suspected persons or were otherwise what they called expendable. Okay, the point they just made, Gottlieb and the CIA established secret detention centers throughout Europe and East Asia and in Japan and in the Philippines, which were, they were under American control in the early 50s. But Gottlieb didn't have to, he didn't have to worry about legal entanglements in these places because they were far away. In other words, it wasn't happening here. That's what you're led to believe from the book and the article. is that these detention centers, these experimental centers, they've left that out of the story. But what we're going to find out is they also existed in the United States. We just heard how the Army was doing the same tests, Fort Detrick, Maryland, also inside the United States, Canada, and Mexico. So let's see what we can find out from the documentary about that issue. Were there other So we just saw how we saw where it was in where the Army was doing those tests inside the United States. What about Canada? You see, if they don't mention that these experiments were going on inside our own borders, United States and Canada, it's easier to sweep it under the rug and just say, they were just misbehaving. They didn't do this to any of our people.
By far, the most chilling experiments we have uncovered took place at this Gothic estate called Raven's Crag, halfway up Mount Royal in Montreal. It houses the Allen Memorial Institute of Psychiatry of McGill University. It was here that the CIA funded a series of experiments, severe experiments. The work was done by the Institute's then director, Dr. Ewan Cameron. It is the closest experimentation to brainwashing yet disclosed. His work, unprecedented in psychiatry, consisted of 3 areas which he called sleep therapy, psychic driving, and the ultimate depatterning. Dr.
Okay, so there we go. Ravens Crag in Canada. And a moment ago, we heard from that the same experiments were going on by the Army inside the United States. CIA officers in Europe and Asia were capturing enemy agents and others. See, the idea is, let's think about this was only done to enemy agents, right? We were only doing these to people who deserved it, and others who they felt might be suspected persons or were otherwise what they called expendable. Expendable people we catch out in war. People who are beneath us, right? They would grab these people and throw them into cells and then test all kinds of not just drug potions, but other techniques like electroshock, extremes of temperature, sensory isolation. All the meantime, bombarding them with questions, trying to see if they could break down the resistance and find a way to destroy the human ego. So these were projects designed not only to understand the human mind, but to figure out how to destroy it. That made Gottlieb, although in some ways a very compassionate person, the article says, certainly the most prolific torturer of his generation. Let me read that sentence again. And that made Gottlieb, although in some ways a very compassionate person, certainly the most prolific torturer of his generation. Now, what we're getting at here is the idea that LSD is somehow something that expands your mind, that it's a good thing. That's the subtext kind of that we get from the article, is that, all of this was really bad, but, we did take that one good thing from it, that whole revolution in the 60s and how we all expanded our consciousness. Is that what really happened? Let's listen to this story.
That's a very good comparison.
Brainwashing.
Yes, to life.
Val Orlico of Winnipeg, Canada, the wife of a member of the Canadian Parliament, was a patient of Dr. Cameron's. She entered the Allen Memorial Institute because of severe depression. She describes for the first time publicly the LSD therapy and psychic driving treatment that she was given by Dr. Cameron.
And then the drug began to take hold very rapidly because it was an IV injection, and things became very furry and very frightening. and had a lot of sensations that it's very difficult to recall. Nobody explained it to me. Nobody ever asked me if I was willing to do it or anything.
He had this feeling that he would be able to get through the resistance of illness and to reach deep changes very quickly.
Did he?
I don't think that when you look at that
Patient. Cameron wrote that this was the way to make direct controlled changes in personality.
I thought this was the coldest and most impersonal treatment that anybody.
Does this woman look to you like an enemy? Like someone you found out? Is she expendable? Did she have a wonderful mind expanding journey?
Could give to anybody in the world. And I became more and more despondent and more angry. I just became so despondent that I thought I can't live like this any longer. And I thought I would just go out and throw myself underneath the cars on McGregor. I stood on the curb of that street and I stood there and I thought, okay, go. And then I thought, what if you're not killed? What if you're just maimed? What if you don't die and you live and you can't even talk anymore? And I couldn't do it.
What she says next, I want to play this part for you, but just as a kind of a side note, I want you to, if you're familiar with what SRA or satanic ritual abuse, this de-patterning that they're talking about, this fracturing of the psyche, this is all done as a part of a federally funded experiment, an operation. And what we're hearing here sounds an awful lot like monarch mind control. How someone is, or even a child, especially, this is especially done to children, where trauma is introduced over and over. And that traumatic experience causes in lack of better terms, these terms are not really, they're not really accurate, but they're only terms we have. A fracturing of the psyche, of the person's personality through this trauma. And then as a result of that, it's possible to slip in new ideas, a new personality, because the person dissociates from their experience. And while they're dissociated, apparently, you can slip other ideas and impressions into the mind and create an alter ego. Now listen to this lady's story as it continues.
The most severe technique Cameron used was de-patterning. He described it as breaking up the existing patterns of behavior by means of intensive electroshock therapy with prolonged periods of sleep. He carried out these experiments in something he called the sleep rooms.
People in there were like babies. They cried and they were very disoriented. And we were very afraid of the sleep room. We used to walk very carefully against the side of the corridor that was opposite the sleep room with our backs to the wall when we'd go by.
Cameron used this combined sleep electroshock treatment on patients as long as 30 days. One patient he kept asleep for 65 days. Cameron retired, and his successor, Dr. Robert Cleghorn, ordered a follow-up study on the patients treated with Cameron's
Okay, does that sound like the same thing that's being talked about in this article? Are some things being left out in this man's report of the MK Ultra and all its sub-projects? Here we have a man, Dr. James Moore, from the University of Delaware, was a CIA asset and a chemist. Now let's listen to, you're going to get an idea of the mindset of those who were directly involved in this program.
In behavior, changes in mental attitude.
Did you ever consider what would have happened if any of these substances were given to, say, unwitting people?
Oh, I don't remember having considered that specifically.
What if you, I trust perhaps you've thought about it.
Well, I haven't worried about it. Your question again, what would I have thought had I known that
Any of these substances would
have been given to
unwitting persons?
You mean a hostile agent of another government?
No, I mean,
think that was probably one of the things I had in mind.
I mean, testing it out on an American citizen.
I guess I must seem very, very cold-blooded about this, but I don't recall ever having been very much preoccupied with that issue.
Interesting, huh? Okay, now, earlier in the article, we saw where it said Gottlieb and the CIA established secret detention centers throughout Europe and East Asia, particularly in Japan, Germany, and the Philippines. So we get no mention of what's going on right here in the United States. And I showed you what was going on in Canada. What about the United States? Surely this wasn't just allowed to go on in the streets, right? It wasn't allowed to run rampant inside the United States, right? Because we're better than that. We wouldn't let that happen here. Would we?
Who brought in the drugs?
White set up so-called safe houses for the CIA in New York, here in Greenwich Village, and later in San Francisco, in this hotel, and in an apartment atop Telegraph Hill with a commanding view of San Francisco Bay. While the existence of these safe houses was disclosed last year, details of what took place within them has not been told. A former CIA official who worked in the safe houses reveals that they were used not only for drug testing, but to study sexual behavior and how it could be used to manipulate people.
Well, is there any, I think if you're gonna write a responsible article, you're gonna write a book and you're gonna be responsible and you're gonna report the whole story, seems like you need to include that. Seems like you need to include the safe houses and the testing centers that existed right on the streets of major cities in the United States where people were just, I guess prostitutes, drug addicts were gathered up. Who knows? Who knows how many people were done this way? How were these experiments supervised? Gottlieb operated almost completely without supervision. He had sort of a checkoff from his from one boss, and then from his real boss, Richard Helms, and from the CIA director, Alan Dulles. So he had a chain of command. In other words, this is how the mafia works. The Don doesn't tell anyone to go kill anyone. His captains, his lieutenants do that. And so the man at the top always has plausible deniability. Oh, I didn't know that was going on. I didn't know those guys were running around doing that. And you see how this is how the layers worked. And Gottlieb was the one sitting below the director and one other boss, but still over all of these wild and crazy scenes that were happening all over in the streets of the United States, the major cities. But none of them really wanted to know what he was doing. Again, plausible deniability. This guy, Gottlieb, had a license to kill. And they said earlier here how he was sort of a compassionate guy, didn't they? He was allowed to requisition human subjects across the United States and around the world and subject them to any kind of abuse that he wanted, even up to the level of being fatal. And he did it inside the United States. He got people from inside the United States and tested them inside the United States. Yet nobody looked over his shoulder. He never had to file serious reports to anybody. I think the mentality must have been that this project is so important that mind control, if it could be mastered, is the key to global world power. Can't disagree with that. on how Gottlieb destroyed evidence about his experiments when he left the CIA. The end of Gottlieb's career came in 1972 when his patron, Richard Helms, who was then the director of the CIA, was removed by President Richard Nixon. Once Helms was gone, it was just a matter of time until Gottlieb would be gone as well. And most important was that Helms was really the only person at the CIA who had an idea of what Gottlieb had been doing. So as they were both on their way out of the CIA, they agreed that they should destroy all records of MKUltra. Gottlieb actually drove out to the CIA Records Center and ordered the archives to destroy boxes full of MKUltra records. However, it turns out that there were some records found in other places. There was a depot for expense account reports that had not been destroyed, and various other pieces of paper remain. So there's some truth. That's the story that MKUltra primary source researchers have also reported. So there's enough out there to reconstruct some of what went on. But we also have these from documentaries like this. We have eyewitness testimony that isn't actually considered in this article. His effort to wipe away his traces by destroying all those documents in the early 1970s was actually quite successful. Now, what about the idea that this is not just intended to... Well, let's look at this. 5239. I submit that what was learned during the process of Project MKUltra is something that's so useful. The research is so useful. I don't think, the important documents don't get shredded. The important data from experiments is obviously still on hand. And here's a very interesting piece.
Gittinger's appears to have been one of the more
So it goes beyond LSD and drugs. We get into the idea. Now, bear with me here because I'm leading into hypnosis. And you're going to see how this animal had electrodes planted in its brain. But that essentially hypnosis, and done on a mass scale, can have essentially the same effect. Let's watch this.
Other experiments were not as conventional. Neurophysicist Dr. Jose Delgado was financed by the Office of Naval Research. In this experiment, the bull is sedated. Electrodes are implanted in its brain. Delgado transmits an electronic impulse to the center of the bull's brain. Delgado has remote control of the animal. Recently released CIA documents refer to the feasibility of remote control of animals, and that special investigations will be conducted toward the application of selected elements of these techniques to man. Other areas were examined through the 60s and 70s. Brain surgery, psychosurgery, creation of amnesia, parapsychology, manipulation of genes. Even though past and present CIA officials have indicated this kind of work ended in 1963.
Okay, so the point to be made about that, what you just heard was circumstantial evidence to show why we should not put a lot of faith in the psychology industry. What was learned at this time through MKUltra and the project and the sub projects was most certainly put to use in psychology. All the people doing the experiments were almost all psychiatrists, psychologists. So current psychology so-called treatments derive directly from this data from these experiments.
According to George White's diaries, was at a safe house when White conducted what he called an LSD surprise experiment. Dr. Sidney Gottlieb, whom we recently filmed near his California home, oversaw many of the CIA behavioral programs. He retired in 1973 and destroyed the records of this work. In sort of a valedictory letter, Dr. Gottlieb wrote that he and his colleagues had been able to maintain contact with the leading edge of developments in the field of biological and chemical control of human behavior.
Okay. Think Prozac. Think SSRI drugs. Think about the drugs that are given to folks to completely incapacitate them. It all came, for the most part, right out of these projects. That would be something that should belong in a book about Project MK Ultra and its sub-projects, if you're going to write a responsible and detailed book. And if you're going to, I don't know about the book, because I haven't read the book. I've just seen the article about the book. So just based on what the article is telling us, it seems like some things have been left out. Some parts of the story have been left out.
Dr. Gottlieb also testified before the Senate subcommittee, but from an anteroom where he could not be filmed because of what his lawyer termed health and cardiac problems. Dr. Gottlieb declined ABC News' request for an interview. And what of George White, the man who helped the agency in so many of its programs? He would retire here to Stinson Beach, California. And shortly before his death, he wrote to his boss at the CIA, Dr. Sidney Gottlieb, and summed up his career by saying, "It was fun, fun, fun. Where else could a red-blooded American boy lie, kill, and cheat, steal, deceive, rape, and pillage with the sanction and blessing of the All-Highest?"
There you go. There's a bit of honesty. Now that man is George White. No mention in the article of that man because he was quite a rogue. And I think if you're gonna write a book and you want the blessing of the agency so that your book can actually be sold, there might be certain elements of the story you're told not to tell. You keep certain things out, like George White, for example. Let's get an idea of who he was and why his name was left out of this reporting.
We are not professing to tell you the complete story of these activities. These records
Has been told, no, we don't have. The story begins here. It was here that the first halting steps toward mind control began. The shaper and molder of OSS was General Wild Bill Donovan. He said of his group's work, "We may have made mistakes, but we were not afraid to try things that were never done before." In this anything-goes atmosphere, Donovan appointed this man, Stanley Lovell, a Boston industrialist, to break new ground in many scientific and technical fields. Donovan called Lovell his Dr. Moriarty, after the fiendish professor in Sherlock Holmes. Lovell liked the name and posed for this Saturday Evening Post photo. He later wrote of his OSS job that it was, quote, "to stimulate the PEC's bad boy beneath the surface of every American scientist and to say to him, throw all of your normal law-abiding concepts out of the window. Here's a chance to raise merry hell."
I don't know, how would that make you feel if you had a loved one who was treated like the lady whose name is Val Orlico, the one who was put under, subjected to this testing? What if you had a child? What if you had a child? You were a parent in the 60s, early 70s, and you had a child who somehow was maybe given LSD, or maybe just took a hit of acid because they heard it was a cool thing to do, and ended up dead. Well, these guys thought it was an opportunity to raise bloody hell, to have a good time. Let's get the story about a little bit the intro to George White, the wild man of the
It was in this
project.
atmosphere that the search for mind control began. This bizarre man would be an active participant in that search over the next 2 decades. His name is George White, an OSS captain who had formerly been with the Bureau of Narcotics. In his diary, seen here publicly for the first time, White left a legacy of the darker side of American intelligence work. He received his early OSS training at the British-run school at Oshawa, Canada, the same school where Ian Fleming, the creator of James Bond, was trained. White referred to the school in his diaries as the Oshawa School of Mayhem and Murder. Mike Burke, former OSS colleague of White's and now president of Madison Square Garden Center.
Okay.
Documents clearly show that the CIA was attempting to develop agents over whom they had as much control as possible. Agents who would perform tasks contrary to their own good.
Normally conditioned American who's been trained to kill and then to have no memory of having killed. His brain has not only been washed, as they say, it has been dry cleaned.
Now, what I submit to you, once again, is that whatever is possible on one mind, obviously, it's going to be far more valuable if it can be used on 2 minds, or 3, or maybe, how about the whole country?
The Manchurian candidate, controlled by others to do things against his will, possible.
It was a remarkable film because, as far as I'm concerned, it made something totally impossible seem absolutely credible.
I would say the answer is yes, but there are many qualifications to that.
Dr. Milton Klein, a psychologist, a clinical and experimental hypnotist, and unpaid consultant to the CIA.
The qualifications would be the subject selected to produce the kind of behavior that you wish, the amount of time, the procedures that are utilized, and the motivations of the people who are designing, executing, and administering the procedures. You're asking whether an individual can be, under hypnosis, influenced, coerced, persuaded, shaped to perform an antisocial act, or a destructive act, or an act of violence. My answer would be yes.
Captain Marco, will you be good enough to lend Raymond your pistol, please? Yes, ma'am.
Thanks, Ben.
Sure, kid. Shoot Bobby, Raymond. Through the forehead.
Yes, ma'am.
How valuable a tool can hypnosis be in the intelligence field?
None whatsoever. It has absolutely no use because nobody's ever been able to do that I know of, do it in an operationally feasible way.
Okay, well, Mr. Gittinger, it's clearly never been to a hypnosis show. Now, hypnosis is obviously a very effective way to control someone, at least in the short term and in the long term, with subconscious suggestion or planting certain keywords while under hypnosis. This has been shown over and over and over. Now, the reason I wanted to play that last bit to finish this story up with, we're done with the NPR article. We've seen how it told some truth, but it left some gaping holes. But what else has been done in the years since MKUltra that is possibly a continuation of MKUltra, the same type of experiments, the Milgram shock experiment? If you remember this, now the reason I want to bring this up is because I want to make the point that we are extremely susceptible to suggestion. When you sit and watch a television for a little while, you go into a certain relaxed state where you become very suggestible. How many people do you know that are parked in front of a television or looking at a phone screen? We're looking into screens constantly today. The likelihood for us to be taken in and our minds directed down some path we never intended to be on is far greater today than it has ever been in history. So let's look back into the past and see what has been done to people who are not subjected to as much potential sources of mind control as we are today. The Milgram shock experiment. One of the most famous studies of obedience in psychology was carried out by Stanley Milgram, a psychologist at Yale University. He conducted an experiment focusing on the conflict between obedience to authority and personal conscience. Milgram in 1963 examined justifications for acts of genocide offered by those accused at the World War II Nuremberg war criminals trials. Their defense often was based on obedience, that they were just following orders from their superiors. How many times have you heard someone say, I was just doing my job? Is that good enough? Is that answer good enough? Is it good enough? Is it a good enough of an answer for a police officer to just say, I was just doing my job? Or what about the 23 or 25-year-old young man or woman who sits in a cubicle in, I don't know, Las Vegas, basically playing a video game, flying drone operations somewhere on the other side of the world, bombing and killing people, and they go home that night and they have dinner with their family? I was just doing my job. Is that going to be enough in the end? Is that what we've come to? Is that, looking at MK Ultra and what's happened since that program was started and the effects that it's had on the psychological industry or the psychology industry, and the fact that we know that our world, the world of entertainment and news, is inundated with ways to get into our minds. Edward Bernays, with his book, Propaganda, back before propaganda was a bad word, makes it very clear that the key to advertisement, the key to marketing, the key to moving people toward one mind of thought lies in psychology. The Milgram experiments began in July 1961, a year after the trial of Adolf Eichmann in Jerusalem. Milgram devised the experiment to answer the question, could it be that Eichmann and his million accomplices in the Holocaust were just following orders? Could we call them all accomplices? Milgram in 1963 wanted to investigate whether Germans were particularly obedient to authority figures, as this was a common explanation for the Nazi killings in World War II. Milgram selected participants for his experiment by newspaper advertising for male participants to take part in a study of learning at Yale University. The procedure was that the participant was paired with another person, and they drew lots to find out who would be the learner and who would be the teacher. This is the basic authority. And one is in authority and one is in submission. The draw was fixed so that the participant was always the teacher. So it was set up so that the people who answered the ad and came in would always end up being the teacher, unbeknownst to them, because the other person, the learner, was going to be an actor that they didn't see. So the learner was one of Milgram's confederates or someone that worked for him, pretending to be a real participant. The learner man called Mr. Wallace, was taken into a room and had electrodes attached to his arms. And the teacher and researcher went into a room next door that contained an electric shock generator and a row of switches marked from 15 volts, which is a slight shock, to 375 volts, which is dangerous, severe shock, up to 450 volts, which is death. That would be death. So let's see if we can get away with playing this. The aim, Milgram was interested in researching how far will people go in obeying an instruction if it involved harming another person. Milgram was interested in how easily ordinary people could be influenced into committing atrocities. How easily could it be to convince ordinary people today through media, through news, through the internet, through apps and our phones, to be detached? Not necessarily that they want to control everyone into a state where we're attacking one another, or just how about if we just make everyone detached from reality?
Each wrong answer.
Cloud. Horse, rock, house. Answer. Wrong. 150 volts. Answer, horse.
Oh. Experiment. That's all. Get me out of here. Get me out of here, please.
Continue, please. Go right on.
I refuse to go on. Let me out.
Keep in mind, this guy can get up and leave anytime he wants. No one's making him do this. It's the idea of authority. Either there is an authority telling me to do this, or I feel like I'm in an authority position. I don't know what to do, so I freeze and I just do what I'm told. I just do my job.
The experiment requires you continue, teacher. Please continue.
Participants didn't know that the learner was really an actor and the so-called sharks harmless.
You're gonna get a shock. 180 volts.
I can't stand the pain. Let me out of here.
Can't stand it. I'm not gonna kill that man there. I mean, who's gonna take the...
Fatal electric shock when encouraged to do so.
It's interesting. The man just turned around and asked, who's going to take the responsibility? And I kill him. Well, he's the one doing it. He's free to get up and leave anytime he wants. Is it not interesting? What they found out was this is how most people behave. This is how most people react to authority.
By what they perceived as a legitimate authority figure. In this case, a man in a white coat.
375 volts. I think something's happened to that fellow in there. I don't get no answer. He was hollering for less voltage. Can't you check in and see if he's all right, please?
Milgram's findings horrified America. They showed that decent American citizens were as capable of committing acts against their conscience as the Germans had been under the Nazis.
That is because we are in a fallen state. We're not as good as we think we are. We're not as advanced and progressive as we think we are. We have to be aware that we are susceptible to all manner of deceptions and the false authority, false gospels. Therefore, we have to get into the truth and live there and not divert from it at all. Because when we get out and start thinking that, I'm okay, I am my own savior, that's what happens. Because we're susceptible. We're susceptible to these things. We're not as advanced as we think we are. The new age will tell you that you're your own, you are a God. But there's the truth of who we are. Also, the Stanford prison experiment. Now, this was another one that's similar. On a quiet Sunday morning in August, a Palo Alto, California police car swept through the town picking up college students as a part of a mass arrest for a violation of Penal Codes 211, armed robbery, and burglary. of 459 PC. The suspect was picked up at his home, charged, warned of his legal rights, spread eagle against the police car, searched and handcuffed, often as surprised and curious neighbors looked on. The suspect was then put in the rear of a police car and carried off to the police station, sirens wailing. The car arrived at the station. The suspect was brought inside, formally booked, again warned of his Miranda rights, fingerprinted, and a complete identification was made. The suspect was then taken to a holding cell where he was left blindfolded to ponder his fate and wonder what he had done to get himself into this mess. These were volunteers. What suspects had done was to answer a local newspaper ad calling for volunteers in a study of the psychological effects of prison life. We wanted to see what the psychological effects were of becoming a prisoner or a prison guard. Once again, these people were aware of the roles they were playing. They were free to leave at any time. To do this, some of them were placed in position to be a prisoner, and some were placed in position to be a guard. To do this, we decided to set up a simulated prison and then carefully note the effects of this institution on the behavior of all those within its walls. More than 70 applicants answered our ad and were given diagnostic interviews and personality tests to eliminate candidates with psychological problems, medical disabilities, or a history of crime and drug abuse. Ultimately, we were left with a sample of 24 college students from the U.S. and Canada who happened to be in the Stanford area and wanted to earn $15 a day by participating in a study. They were getting paid. They were free to leave at any time. On all dimensions that we were able to test or observe, they reacted normally. Our study of prison life began. Then, with an average group of healthy, intelligent, middle-class males, these boys were arbitrarily divided into two groups by a flip of the coin. Half were randomly assigned to be guards, the other half to be prisoners. It is important to remember that at the beginning of our experiment, there were no differences between boys assigned to be a prisoner and boys assigned to be guard. And there's the ad. To help us closely simulate a prison environment, we called upon the services of experienced consultants. Foremost among them was a former prisoner who had served nearly 17 years behind bars. This consultant made us aware of what it was like to be a prisoner. He also introduced us to a number of other ex-convicts and correctional personnel. During an earlier Stanford summer school class, we co-taught on the psychology of imprisonment. Our prison was constructed by boarding up each end of a corridor in the basement of Stanford's psychology department building. That corridor was the yard and was the only outside place where prisoners were allowed to walk, eat, or exercise, except to go to the toilet down the hallway, which prisoners had to do blindfolded so as to not know the way out of the prison. Again, voluntarily. They did this voluntarily, and they were paid. So they volunteered and were paid. To create prison cells, we took the doors off some laboratory rooms and replaced them with specially made doors with steel bars and cell numbers. An intercom system allowed us to secretly bug the cells to monitor what the prisoners discussed, and also to make public announcements to the prisoners. There were no windows or clocks to judge the passage of time, which later resulted in some time-distorting experiences. With these features in place, our jail was ready to receive its first prisoners who were waiting in the detention cells of the Palo Alto Police Department. Blindfolded and in a state of mild shock over their surprise arrest by the city police, our prisoners were put into a car and driven to the Stanford County Jail, quote-unquote Stanford County Jail, for further processing. The prisoners were then brought into our jail one at a time and greeted by the warden, who conveyed the seriousness of their offense and their new status as prisoners. Each prisoner was systematically searched and stripped naked. He was then deloused with spray to convey our belief that he may have germs or lice, as can be seen in this series of photos. So they were dehumanized. A degradation procedure was designed in part to humiliate prisoners and in part to be sure they weren't bringing in any germs to contaminate our jail. This procedure was similar to the scenes captured by Danny Lyons in these Texas prison photos. It's also what we do with prisoners of war. Remember Abu Ghraib? The prisoner was then issued a uniform. It should be clear that we were trying to create a functional simulation of a prison, not a literal prison. Real male prisoners don't wear dresses. But real male prisoners do feel humiliated and do feel emasculated. That goes back to the type of clothes they made them wear. Now let's get to the point of the behavior. Let's find out what happened. So we're humiliated, placed in this position of where some are guards and some are prisoners. The guards were given no specific training on how to be guards. Instead, they were free, within limits, to do whatever they thought was necessary to maintain law and order in the prison and to command the respect of the prisoners. The guards made up their own set of rules, which they then carried into effect under the supervision of Warden David Jaffe, an undergraduate from the Stanford University. They were warned, however, of the potential seriousness of their mission and of the possible dangers in the situation they were about to enter, as, of course, are real guards who voluntarily take such a dangerous job. We began with 9 guards and 9 prisoners in our jail. 3 guards worked each of 3 8-hour shifts, while 3 prisoners occupied each of the 3 Baron cells around the clock. All right, so we've got our asserting authority. At 2:30 a.m., the prisoners were rudely awakened from sleep by blasting whistles for the first of many counts. All right, we get the idea is we're shocking these people. We're putting them in a position to be dominated. They're under authority. They're experiencing a position of submission. What's interesting is the response that these people had. These are volunteers, remember? Because the first day passed without incident, we were surprised and totally unprepared for the rebellion which broke out on the morning of the second day. Keep in mind, these are volunteers. They could leave anytime they wanted to. But pay attention to what the mind does. The prisoners removed their stocking caps, ripped off their numbers, and barricaded themselves inside the cells by putting their beds against the door. And now the problem was, what were we going to do about this rebellion? The guards were very much angered and frustrated because the prisoners also began to taunt and curse them. When the morning shift of guards came on, they became upset at the night shift, who they felt must have been too lenient. The guards had to handle the rebellion themselves, and what they did was fascinating for the staff to behold. Now, all they've done is told these people that you're the guard. They didn't train them to do anything. What you have, the response that you see happen is just the human mind. It's just, this is what we do. So whenever you hear that old canard about people are basically good, we're all just basically good, don't believe that. We're not. We need a savior. We absolutely need a savior. We're not good. At first, they insisted that reinforcements be called in. The 3 guards who were waiting on standby call at home came in, and the night shift of guards voluntarily remained on duty to bolster the morning shift. The guards met and decided to treat force with force. They got a fire extinguisher, which shot a stream of skin-chilling carbon dioxide, and they forced the prisoners away from the doors. The fire extinguishers were present in compliance with the requirement by the Stanford Human Subjects Research Panel, which was concerned about potential fire threats. The guards broke into each cell. Once again, let me point out, volunteers could leave anytime they wanted. The guards broke into each cell, stripped the prisoners naked, took the beds out, forced the ringleaders of the prisoner rebellion into solitary confinement, and generally began to harass and intimidate the prisoners. I was just doing my job. The rebellion had been temporarily crushed, but now a new problem faced the guards. Sure, 9 guards with clubs could put down a rebellion by 9 prisoners, but you couldn't have 9 guards on duty at all times. See the problem now. It's obvious that our prison budget could not support such a ratio of staff to inmates. So what were they going to do? One of the guards came up with a solution. Let's use psychological tactics instead of physical ones. This is the reason why I wanted to share this experiment with you. They came up with this idea on their own. They had no training. Let's use psychological tactics instead of physical ones. Psychological tactics amounted to setting up a privilege cell. One of the 3 cells was designated a privilege cell. The 3 prisoners least involved in the rebellion were given special privileges. Yeah, a little gold star. If you're a good citizen, if you're a good boy, you get a little gold star. They got their uniforms back, got their beds back, and were allowed to wash and brush their teeth. The others were not. Privileged prisoners also got to eat special food in the presence of other prisoners who had temporarily lost the privilege of eating. Lost the privilege of eating. I have to say once again, volunteers, being paid, could leave anytime they wanted. The effect was to break the solidarity among the prisoners. After a half a day of this treatment, the guards then took some of these quote-unquote good prisoners and put them into bad cells, and took some of the bad prisoners and put them into the good cell, thoroughly confusing all the prisoners. Some of the prisoners who were the ringleaders now thought that the prisoners from the privileged cell must be informers. And suddenly, prisoners became distrustful of one another. The prisoners' rebellion also played an important role in producing greater solidarity among the guards. Now suddenly it was no longer just an experiment. Now suddenly it was no longer just an experiment. No longer a simple simulation. Instead, the guards saw the prisoners as troublemakers who were out to get them, who might really cause them some harm. Volunteers. Getting paid. Could leave anytime they wanted. But they really thought that they might really cause harm to them. In response to this threat, the guards began stepping up their controls, surveillance, and aggression. Every aspect of the prisoner's behavior fell under the total and arbitrary control of the guards. Even going to the toilet became a privilege. All right, why am I sharing this? Because this is who we really are. This is who we really are as human beings. We're not basically good. Like the New Age will tell you, we're not basically good. We must humble ourselves before the Creator, before our Savior. We're not basically good. The idea that we can have 7 billion subjective truths, everyone with their own idea of a moral idea of what is right and wrong, 7 billion different ideas of right and wrong, it's chaos. It's pure chaos. If this is how our minds actually operate under stress in the real world, in real life. And I share this because in conjunction with the MK Ultra article, because they're all related. These things never stopped. The psychology industry diagnoses people today with very severe sounding conditions and ailments that have no test whatsoever, no blood test, no hair test, no poop test, no skin test, no urine test, no written test, no oral test. I guess it's an oral test because all they're doing is listening to what you say. And by that, they diagnose people with conditions that suddenly require very, very invasive, very strong and harmful chemicals introduced into the human body. And why do we allow it to happen? Why don't we question things like that? Because we're susceptible. We're susceptible to listening to whatever the authority says is right. Who is your authority? Who do you make your authority? This is not about rebellion from your... A Christian doesn't rebel. A Christian follows Jesus Christ. There is no need for rebellion when you're in Jesus Christ. But who is your authority? Who do you look to when you're not sure of what to do next or what's coming next? Do you make your authority a man? Someone who could diagnose you with some mental illness that they can't even test you for? Some arbitrary diagnosis that came from the DSM, Diagnostic Statistical Manual. If I go to the doctor with a broken arm, he can fix that broken arm, and he's done a good thing for me. If I go there with a fever and he gives me antibiotics, he's done a good thing for me. If I go there with a heart attack and he treats me for that and I live, he's done a good thing for me. If I go and sit in front of someone who calls themselves a doctor and they don't know who I am, and I sit in front of them for 10 minutes, 15 maybe, and at the end of 10 or 15 minutes, they can tell me what my mental illness is and send me home with 3 medications to start with. Who's my authority? Is that what we've come to? So let's not accept the status quo. Let's always be questioning what we see around us. And more than anything, don't put your faith in men or women. Don't put your faith in mankind. We're fallen. We're in bad shape. We're not good. There is not one of us who is righteous. We need a Savior. And if we all followed that one objective truth, these things wouldn't exist. But they do. This is the world we live in. And that's how it's going to be. So for those who are interested in finding the lifeline out of it, I offer to you the Lord Jesus Christ. That's the only way out. That's the truth. Jesus is the objective truth. The representation, the character of the Creator, the unseen God, the God that was unseen before. Jesus came and showed everyone his character. And in the times before Jesus came, God winked at the idolatry, man believing that he could be his own Savior. Once Jesus Christ came, God doesn't wink at it anymore. The truth has been made evident for everyone to either accept or reject. We're not basically good. Don't believe the New Age. But through a saving knowledge of Jesus Christ, you can see good in people. There is hope. Okay, my friends, I've worn my voice out. I'd like to say God bless you all, and we'll see you next time right here